Excellent. Well, I was going to start by saying some of you may have seen an older version of this talk, but looking at who we have in the audience, I think most of you are new for this. So, I'm Michelle Disraeli, and I'm here to talk about the joy of false positive. Who am I to be talking about this? Well, turns out I've been doing this cyber information security thing for over a decade now. How did that happen? So before I got into doing information security stuff, I did major incident management at Serco, dealing with like the IT fallout from offices going on fire or data centers doing what data centers do, flood. And then from there, I joined their security operations team. I should note there's no other reason Serco's in front of a burning building. And then from joining their security operations team, I went on to work 12-hour stints in a SOC, security operations center, then did security for DevOps, then ended up being a SOC manager, taking a small SOC from a team of 2 junior analysts all the way to more than 8 people, follow the sun arrangement around the world, winning multi-million contracts. Then from there, I did some time at Lloyds Banking Group, integrating transitioning projects into their security operations teams. Then went over to Microsoft Xbox to look at security, privacy, and anti-cheat for their games. And now I'm at Thales Group, looking after Redacted. And also, when I'm not doing that, I'm busy looking at how to do security architecture for hosting digital twins. But throughout this all, I've had one huge passion, and anyone who's talked to me personally knows I'm obsessed with security operations. You can't keep me away from it, and indeed, at Thales, I'm also doing some SOC consultancy work, helping to improve our internal SOCs and improve our commercial offerings. So, I'd like to start this talk talking about why I'm obsessed with security operations. And to do that, we really need to take a step back and ask, why do we even do security? Do we do it because there's cyber bombs and every cyber car? Are we doing it because there's evil masterminds in our midst? Or is it because of the hoodie-wearing hackers lurking and using AI to break into us? That might be what the media and we like to paint it as, but the truth is, we do security because of this. Because we want to keep the world working and people's lives livable and enriched with fun and joy and not having to deal with the rubbish piling up for reasons other than their own executive dysfunction. And so, the truth is, we do security because organizations face risks on their path to success, and we are here to help them navigate those security and privacy risks. And I'm a big believer that one of the most effective ways for organizations to do this is actually through security operations. So what do I mean by security operations? Well, when you look at security within businesses, a good way of modeling it, you've probably seen this before, is the protect, detect, respond model. And this model, I think some of you may be quite familiar with this. So protect, that's all about governance, compliance, getting the right architecture, the right firewall rules, and it also includes delivering training. And then you've got detection. So that's your classic security monitoring. That's also scanning for vulnerabilities and doing penetration tests. That's where any pen testers in the audience fit into this picture. And it also includes doing things like working with the service desk to make sure when security incidents are reported to the service desk, they are then passed through to the proper security professionals to look at. And then we move on to respond. And this is your classic cyber incident response. It's your vulnerability management works. Once you've identified the vulnerabilities, how do you fix them? It's about your crisis management and communication. And it's about the investigations you then do that may involve other parts of the business. So often you may need to work with, say, HR or finance or some other teams to understand what's really going on, what the implications are, and how, as a business, you can resolve it. But it doesn't end there. This is actually, and I'm sure any of you who work with salespeople hate this term, a virtuous cycle. Wherein the outputs from the respond phase then feed in to the protect and detect measures to improve and make a brighter future. So security operations teams actually can do a lot of all of this, whilst you may have a security management layer above it, often translating those policies into processes for protect, may fall to the security operations team, and then the response phase, they'll do the investigations internally. Now within security operations, there's then a sub-discipline within there, which is the Security Operations Centre. And that tends to cover sort of a lot of the detect activities and a bit of the response, normally the initial triage and understanding of what's been going on. And so this is really what my focus of my talk today is on. But everything I'm talking about in terms of false positive management, I think everyone can learn from and improve the work you do to help organisations manage those risks. So what's life actually like in a SOC? Well, according to one of my previous employers, life in a SOC looks like this, which I think they intended to be comforting rather than deeply ominous. But the reality is, if you're a SOC analyst or running a SOC, your life is spent looking at the results from things like this, a screen full of automated alerts. So, what does this actually mean, and how do we get to this position? Well, what I like to think of is the idea of an awareness cascade. So this starts with some action of interest from a security point of view, done by a person, or maybe some malware. So that's the underlying action at the start of this. And then you've got the question of, can we actually observe that's going on? So, for example, if you think about social engineering, so a phishing email, that's an observable action on your IT infrastructure. But somebody getting someone down the pub to say slightly more than they should, that's not normally observable by systems that generate logs. Speaking of which, you get the logs. So whilst you could observe it, are you logging it? And in terms of the logs, the sort of volumes we're talking about here, you normally measure this in thousands of logs per second. So for a typical medium enterprise, you're talking a few thousand logs per second, events per second. So how do you find out then exactly what's important from that? We can't sit there reading the matrix as it flows in. So what we do is we set up automated alerts with some rules behind them to try and spot within those logs something that may indicate an action of interest. And one or more logs may result in one or more alerts. So once you've got these alerts, you then need to triage them and work out actually, are these useful? And so if you've got thousands of logs per second coming in terms of alerts, typically this is hundreds per hour. So your classic SOC environment will have 100 to 200 logs per second for a medium enterprise, maybe more, alerts per second. And so converting that still isn't really manageable. So then your SOC analysts have to dig out through those and analyze them to work out which ones of those are actually indicating incidents. Which alerts indicate an action of interest from a security perspective. And typically you're talking incidents per day. So that's thousands of logs per second, hundreds of alerts per hour, and a handful of incidents a day in a lot of SOC environments. Some may have more incidents a day, but that probably means they've got correspondingly higher alerts and logs in those environments. And if they don't, I commend you on hopefully managing what we're talking about today. Because, as you can probably guess, if you've got hundreds of alerts per second, 100 alerts per hour, and most of those alerts aren't security incidents, they're often what we brand as a false positive. So what do I mean by a false positive? Well, first of all, we need to ask, was something detected? And so this is what we mean by the positive or negative aspect. Positive, the detection system positively saw something, or negative, nothing was seen. And then we need to ask, was this detection, either positive or negative, the correct outcome? And so that's where the true or the false comes in. So let's do a bit of a worked example looking at this. So, as I say, got here a nice little matrix, the arrangement. So what might be a true positive for dangers around the home? I think we'd all agree. If you're walking around the home and you just saw a handgun lying there, and you've got little Timmy and Jessica walking around, you don't want a gun lying around on your coffee table. So I think we'd all agree, if you see a gun and identify a gun as a positive threat around the home, that's a true classification. And then you're also walking around and you see a little cartoon doll. And the cartoon doll, that does not register as a danger to your family. So of course, that is a true result because there's absolutely nothing suspicious at all about a Rainbow Dash doll. But then, what about a false positive? Well, unfortunately, some of you may be all too aware that quite often, if law enforcement are involved, they will mistake toy guns for real. And arguably they're right. It was a gun, so they did positively identify a gun, but they shouldn't have, because it's a toy. So what about a false negative? This one's a lot harder for most people to understand. So a false negative is something that did not register as a threat, but that was a false outcome. It should have been seen as dangerous. And let me tell you, you might think a kitten is cute, but I've got the bite and claw marks to prove they are vicious. So let's do a practical example of this with a real incident from SOC. As always, all the examples I'm presenting today have been anonymised where appropriate to not give away details about the innocent or guilty. So, this was from my times doing 12-hour shifts in the SOC, and I got an IDS alert for a double exec call seen in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, you've got the exec command that lets you pass in a string, and then it runs that as if it's JavaScript. This can be a useful thing for web designers, for certain types of activities, when you're not quite sure what the user's going to be doing, and you want a bit of dynamicness to your environment. So you may see one, but if you see two in a row, that probably indicates that the output of the first outputs something else, sort of decodes it, decrypts maybe. So it obfuscates what's going on. And the thing we see with double exec calls is they're often used as a way of hiding exploit kits, other malicious code. Because your typical scanners are looking for code that says, do nasty things, but instead, that's hidden. So, it's always suspicious when you get one of these. So let's investigate it. So in this case, the JavaScript file itself was on a site offering an online security service, and it was hosted on a nondescript content delivery network. And you might think, oh, that's got to be boring, right? Well, I put it to you that if you're a bad actor, you might think that, yeah, you'll break into a security services site, put an exploit kit on there, and then people who need security help will instead, they're clearly good victims because they need help, will then attack them. So surely that's dangerous. So let's take a look at what JavaScript was actually identified. Yep, that's definitely not normal JavaScript for a website. And you can see there, yep, it definitely goes through that and then decodes that with a double exec call. So let's decode it. Yep, that's really sus. It should never look like that. Okay, let's decode it again. Okay. So what we have here then is some JavaScript that is just polling for all your browser's information, which is really weird. And it might be benign, but also remember, exploit kits are a thing, and a common first step on exploit kits is understand the browser that's accessing you and decide, do we then take further action? So, we don't know yet what's going on. So look into this more. So in this case, the one clue we have is that it has the term incap and encapsula. And throughout that code, beyond setting cookies and pulling all your browser's information, it doesn't do anything with it. And encapsula, being the company name, well, that was actually that security service the code was running on. And it just seemed that they were really aggressively trying to hide their own sort of browser profiling, fingerprinting service that they were doing, and that they offer as a commercial service to people who have websites to try and spot people who they don't want to be accessing their website. So I have a question for you all, and this is a bit of audience participation. The alert in this case was for a double exec call. Was this a false positive? So, any opinions?
Depends on the policy of the site, doesn't it? Because, it depends whether you're happy with the supplier doing that.
That's a really good answer. Any other opinions?
I think no, you're trying to detect two executives. You detected two executives.
We detected two exec calls. That was we positively detected two exec calls, and true, there were two exec calls. So that, and any other opinions?
Some CDNs will try and fingerprint browsers for their bot protection and things like that.
Yeah, so you're saying that although...
It's not very nice, but it's legit.
Yeah, although the detection criteria were met, the rationale is of them doing it is such that this isn't a security incident, that it in fact is benign. So it should be treated as a false positive. And really, that's what this comes down to. The alert was correctly triggered, but it wasn't a security incident. And as a rule, we, as an industry, we tend to classify this sort of thing as a false positive. However, I would argue that's not the case. It was a true positive, but it was not a security incident. But we can't win there. Yes?
I do not think it was a positive, but in the wrong context.
Yeah.
And as such, it shouldn't have triggered an alert because it's from a suitable site.
Yeah,
that's... The false positive element is actually the wasting of the people's time.
Well, that's a really great point, and actually we're going to come back to that.
I have additional point regarding false positive, because with such marking as whitelisting, false positive, we just allow this company to have the pivot further in the future with different updates and with all this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's really what's driving this talk. So whilst strictly speaking, it was a true positive, it was correctly identifying something, we call that a false positive because it's not a security incident. But the thing is that the truth is, we can't change the terminology we use. We're going to, unfortunately, as an industry, keep on calling this sort of thing a false positive. But what we can do is change what we do about this afterwards. And so, I've got another question for you all, and I think some of you have already been answering this. Is time we spend on false positives wasted time? Never. Yes?
Depends whether you want to analyse it again.
Oh.
Waste the SOC time reanalysing the same problem over and over.
That's a really good point. And so, in fact, that leads on to some of my next slides here. Because as mentioned, one of the risks is, whilst it was correctly matching it, that it was over-matching. And this is where the challenge comes in. Because as we mentioned, we want to try and avoid those false negatives. We want to try and spot things that are actually dangerous to our environment. But if we try and reduce the number of false negatives, what we typically see is an increase in false positives. So really, we need to make sure that we improve how we manage false positives and learn from that and improve our processes. And in a lot of SOC environments, what we end up doing is we'll log detailed tickets with all the investigation for the true positives, and the false positives just get closed as false positive with no further details captured. But only by capturing those details and putting in the effort to understand why it flagged up, can we then improve our playbooks or our alerts or processes to actually then reduce the number of false positives again. And a lot of this, in my opinion, comes down to how open we are as an industry about failure. Because let's face it, we're all at SteelCon today, and almost every talk you go to is going to be about how amazing the exploit they discovered was, and how they stopped this big malware ring, and how they defended their environment against something. Everyone's, and myself included, I'm going to be bigging themselves up and talking about them being successful. And yet, is that what we do in the office? Because when we go into the office, instead, what we're normally doing is we're swearing at the applications we use, we're cursing the teams we support for not understanding security. We know we've got staff members who consistently, every year, cause audits to fail. And, well, in general, the internet was a mistake. And then, within the security, that then extends to the Security Operations Center. Because within the Security Operations Center, normally the analysts are sitting there wondering why the hell no one is patching anything. Normally, with a good understanding that the infrastructure, that the environments they support are hella dangerous and are going to be the result of a major incident. And more than anything, I would argue that Security Operations Center teams are perhaps the only people in a business who really understand what a business is and what really goes on within a business. And yet, what normally appears in SOC reports? Most SOC reports that Security Operations Centers deliver to senior management say that over this last month, we looked at just over 1,000 alerts. Of those, 90% of them were false positives. We raised a handful of incidents. Please, can we have some more money to doing, as far as you can tell, absolutely nothing? That's all SOC reports have. And it's not a good look if you want to keep running your SOC and you want to demonstrate the value of your Security Operations Center to the business. So I would argue if you want to get better, and we want to get the funding to get better, we need to get better at sharing our failures. And really, the thesis of my talk today is that I would argue that the vast majority of false positives you see aren't boring false positives. They are actionable intelligence. And in fact, ISO 27002, the 2022 revision of it, has introduced Control 5.7 for threat intelligence. So now, as part of your security management plans, you are commanded, if you want to pass the ISO standard, to carry out threat intelligence. And that includes not just understanding the bad guys acting against you, but also understanding where the issues lie within your environment and what good looks like in your environment so you can actually spot the bad when it happens. So, how do I suggest that you can then turn these false positives into some actionable intelligence? Well, of course, the first step is the alert might just be awful. And it may just genuinely be a false positive. You need to change the alert itself. And that's always the case. But once you've looked at that, the next question I like to ask, and I get my teams to ask, is, was this false positive the result of configuration, an issue with the way we design and run and code our environments, or was it due to a user doing something within the environment and taking steps? Then, the other question my team and I ask is, was this activity that we see, and we're classifying as false positive, something that we consider to be authorised, that we allow within our environment, that we accept? Or was it something that we shouldn't really allow? And that may be the case. That a lot of things that happen in corporate environments really shouldn't be allowed, but are allowed anyway. And I'd love it to be the case that if everything that was unauthorised was an incident, but the reality in a lot of businesses is you get told, no, that can't be an incident. So let's put this into practice and analyse some of these quadrants here. So, authorised configuration. Why might that flag up? Well, again, talking about a client of mine. They were a major business processing outsourcing provider. They had FTSE 100 companies as their customers. And so there was a lot of money running through them and very important services they provided. And so their entire core services ran off Telnet. Sure, it was all internal, but as any pen tester, red teamer in the room knows, just because it's internal doesn't mean it shouldn't be encrypted. And in fact, they had FTP connections that didn't have encryption set up on them. And what's worse is for some clients, those clients cared about security. So they gave those clients VPNs. And those VPN access points were not locked down, so the clients could do whatever the hell they liked from that point. And yeah, I think we've all seen this. This is legacy infrastructure. You know, I've got a saying that there's only two types of systems: legacy systems and those that do nothing useful. And that's the unfortunate reality of things. But that doesn't mean we should just close the tickets as false positives. Because that IT manager who runs that legacy infrastructure, what they need is some ammunition to go to the board and go, we need to fix this. And so you, as a security professional, some of the most empowered people in the business, to give them that reason for changing it. Because you can highlight the risks of that infrastructure to them. So what about unauthorized configuration? So I've got no single example for this, because unfortunately, this is every network ever. So unauthorized configuration includes such things as service accounts failing to log on. That's just commonplace. Remote desktop access left on. Again, absolutely normal. And file stores at remote sites. Any company that has a WAN will end up with someone at their desk with a copy of all the key file stores, their team users, sharing it locally. And yeah, sure, that's against policy, but as a business, the word from the pie is ignore it. It keeps the business running, and that's what matters. And that might mean the policy isn't fit for purpose, or it might mean they need to understand what the risks are with the policies not being followed. Again, the security operations team are some of the most empowered people in the business to highlight those risks. Just because it's business as usual doesn't mean we should keep quiet about it. So what about authorized activity? Why might authorized activity cause false positive? Well, let's look at a very real example here. And I think this is quite similar to some of the points some of you were raising earlier. So, we saw an alert for a suspicious DNS query to a .pw domain. And so this was a DNS request for a string of random characters, .pw. And that's very suspicious, because a string of random characters is something we commonly see used by malware command and control systems. They'll randomly generate domain names, they'll cycle through those as a way of evading detection or defensive measures. So, this is a very common alert that SOCs set up, and is often very, very, very useful. It's also something that if you see random characters in a subdomain, that might be DNS exfiltration. And if you ever hear a salesperson saying that DNS exfiltration is just traffic going out over port 52, shoot them. So what happens? So this is is very suspicious. So let's look into this further. So this DNS resolved to an IP address in Russia. So again, very suspicious. And this was for a UK local council was the client for this one. So that's doubly suspicious. So we looked up all the traffic. We looked up the traffic that was going for IP address, and it was HTTP downloading JavaScript. Yeah, it was just boring JavaScript, but still, it's kind of unusual, kind of weird. And the referrer for that HTTP traffic was another string of random characters to .ru. Which again, why would something legitimate use random character strings in a domain name? So, what I did was I then chained down the referrer chain. So, pulled up the DNS, pulled up the IP address for that random characters.ru, pulled down the HTTP traffic to that, look at the referrer header, and then continue going down that chain in the packet captures. And what do I ultimately find? It's LiveJournal. So LiveJournal these days is, if those of you who are, so LiveJournal was one of the early social media networks back in the late 90s, early 2000s. These days it's owned by a Russian company. And you might think, well, why is anyone legit still using LiveJournal? And the truth is that there's still a lot of communities on LiveJournal, especially minority groups or interests make a lot of use of LiveJournal still and haven't moved fully over to things like Dreamweb or Archive of Our Own or Tumblr. So we'll still see legitimate traffic there. So in this case, this alert that correctly identifies something is a false positive because it's authorized activity. We give people internet access, and well, humans are going to human. If you give them internet access, they are going to do a whole wide range of diverse things. And I think another example of this was one of the environments I've supported had information marked HMG secret. So we had an email rule set up to look for the word secret in email headers. And all it ever found, and I had to review the logs of this every day, was people trying to arrange birthday surprises. Yes, this alert was correctly picking up the word secret, but no, it shouldn't have been. and then the other big takeaway we can get from this, and I think this is an important lesson for everyone who works in security operations and security in general, is that if you're looking at log data, you're going to encounter far more personal data than you think you are, and often some of the most sensitive personal data in the business, because you will find people Googling about cancer, or their sexuality, or their gender, or trade unions. These are all things that we need to treat very, very sensitively as a matter of law. So it's very important that SOC analysts are appropriately trained in this, and that we don't react with surprise when we see this. So there's lots of ways we can learn from these events. So what about unauthorized activity? This is surely always a major security incident, right? If we see unauthorized activity on the network, we raise that. Well, let me give you a real example. As I mentioned, I worked at Microsoft Xbox Game Studio Rare, so one of UK's longest-standing game studios, with their flagship, pun-intended game, Sea of Thieves. And Sea of Thieves had a cheating problem at the time. If you're a current player, don't comment. And the issue we were seeing at that time is the cheaters had found a way of making a cheat to pull down a list of every player on a server. They would then rapidly cycle through servers, pulling down a list of players and seeing if any of those players were juicy targets for them. And so, for example, they'd be looking for things like Rare or Microsoft employees. They'd be looking for streamers, especially streamers who are currently online, or just people they had a general beef with. They'd cycle through the servers, looking for the people, and then pile on the server to harass them. And so what we knew is the cheaters were rapidly, whilst the technical work was going on to fix the underlying issue that allowed the cheat, we wanted to see who was using the cheat So we did a scan for anyone's account who was rapidly hopping between servers, because we knew that's what the bad guys were doing. And what we found was one of our senior team was actually doing this, rapidly hopping between servers. So we talked to them and discovered we'd got the wrong end of the stick a little. Because the thing with Sea of Thieves, so Sea of Thieves is a massively-ish multiplayer first-person game where you're playing pirates and you can fight anyone you like, any other player you like on the server. And of course that means some players want to raise what's known as the Reaper's Mark, a flag that declares that you are a bad person and you're going to kill everyone else on the server. So, for fans of multiplayer games, yeah, a player killer. They'll publicly declare himself to be a player killer. And as anyone who plays massive multiplayer games knows, where you get player killers, you get player killer killers. Players whose hobby it is to hunt down players who kill other players. And the nice thing with the Reaper's Mark is when a player raises it to declare themselves evil, that's then displayed on the map for all other players to see. And so what this senior staff member was doing was they are hopping between servers, checking the map to see if they could see a Reaper's Mark on the map. And if they did, then go find the Reaper, kill them, move on to the next server. And they were really good at hopping between servers really, really fast. So the thing in this case was that our assumptions about our game were wrong. And I think it's an important thing to remember here that the purpose of a system is what it does. If your environment and policies allow for something, even if you think it's not authorized, you're allowing it. And it's going to happen. And sometimes that might be because the activity itself is wrong and you're not locking things down. Or it might be that the ideals of governance and management are so detached from reality. Remember, those who write policies and processes normally are not the people on the coalface actually doing the work. So just because it's scary doesn't mean it's an incident. So as you can see, this model here gives you some idea of how you can then place things and have an idea of what the next steps may be in addressing it. But it's not just, the importance of looking at false positives isn't just about threat intelligence and improving your alerts. As I mentioned, as an analyst, you're normally looking at hundreds of alerts per hour, but then maybe one incident an hour. And if that sounds like burnout, you're right. And unfortunately, there are two fates for SOC analysts. They either end up ignoring everything and logging everything as a false positive, or they decide the only way of explaining so many alerts is there must be a major breach going on. And they begin shouting about the dangers. So by having a process in place to let them manage false positives actively and turn that effort from wasted into meaningful security improvements, what you do is you help them feel valued and help them feel like they're making a real difference to the business. And there's another thing we can do to help them feel valued, and that's closing the loop. So a lot of security operations centers out there operate on quite a strict first, second, third line type setup. And when I was a SOC manager, so many of the analysts I had interviewed who worked with SOCs with that strict first, second, third line tiering, if they worked on first line, they had no idea what happened with the tickets they logged, no matter how exciting they were. And if that sounds demoralizing, you're absolutely right. And this closing the loop applies not just for things that turn out to be incidents, but turn out to be boring. Because SOC analysts, by the very nature of their job, they're curious, they're interested, they want to know the outcomes and how they can do better. So let me give you another real story. So this is a tale about a financial services client of mine, and they had high street banks, and a common form of fraud at high street banks is where the bank teller accesses an account again shortly after they accessed it because of a customer. This is something that unfortunately was often seen as a means, so the bank teller would keep details of the account. After the customer went, they'll go back into the account, shuffle money around a little. Just side note here, most bank tellers committing this sort of fraud, they're not evil people, they normally have ended up with a gambling problem or a health condition or something else shitty in their life they don't know how else to handle. And so some of the work the financial institution was also doing was on making sure people knew how to access help, because that was the most effective way of reducing fraud. So the SOC I was supporting saw an alert come through for this sort of transaction, and it was really regular. It was every Tuesday at the same time. So this is really quite clear indication of fraud, right? So this was passed by that SOC team through to the proper fraud investigators. They went out to site, sat down with the bank teller and the manager, and went, we can see here, every Tuesday at 11, you access this one customer's account. And then half an hour later, you access the account again. This is really suspicious. And the bank manager and teller looked at each other and laughed. And it wasn't because they were just that evil. It was because they had a regular customer. Or rather, customers. There was a sweet old couple who every Tuesday would go shopping. And then they'd come to the bank. And the sweet old couple then at the bank, the husband would go in on his own, or the wife waited patiently outside. The husband would do his banking needs with their joint bank account at the bank teller, go back outside, and then the wife would go in to access the joint account again for her banking needs, while the husband dutifully waited outside. It might be odd, but really it's super sweet and adorable. So this wasn't fraud, it was just an unexpected, sweet activity. And luckily, that fraud investigation team was able to pass the story on to the SOC so they could understand what happened and that they were right to raise it, even if it turned out to not be a security issue. There is a final reason, after all of this though, why I think it's important to actually give your analysts time to look at false positives. And that's that if you trust your analysts, they'll become beginners at threat hunting. So another incident I handled, I got an alert for malicious Shockwave flash file, pulled down the file, looked at it. The Shockwave flash file was a boring video player. We knew about this. It flagged up as a false positive all the time. And I went about my day. Half an hour later, though, my brain went, what was the URL for that again? So I went back, looked at the logs. Oh no. This is Godowski. Next log. Frantic, furious and female. Next log. Sexy maiden witch. And I still am an anime fan. I used to be really into the anime community, in fact. And so I was aware that the rest of this long list was all hentai. Japanese animated porn. And the IP address was a public library. So this was someone having what the kids would say is a goon session at a public access computer in a library. And so the truth is that when you get a false positive alert, they can often actually be an indicator that something's a little off. And if you trust your analysts and give them the time to investigate them properly and document the false positive, they might actually uncover the real incident lying underneath. So, in summary, security operations, I think, is one of the best ways for organizations to help manage the risks on their path to success. You typically have thousands of logs a second, hundreds of alerts per hour, and a handful of incidents a day, maybe a dozen. And so you get a lot of alerts of rarely incidents, but are they really false positives? And so by classifying false positives, we can help take action to manage the risks, and being honest and open about what you're seeing can actually help the SOC show its true and full value to the business and help address some of the real security risks. It can also, by letting analysts properly classify false positives, help avoid analyst burnout or nihilism. And you can also help analysts feel reported by reporting back to them the results of incidents, especially when they turn out to be false positives. And let us in general just feel less afraid to start to talk about our failures, both at conferences and within our organisations. Because only by talking about the issues, the boring stuff, can we actually start addressing any of it. Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, I would welcome them, or alternatively, please feel free to share any of your favourite false positives, and I'll be around all day if you want to catch up in the corridors. Thank you.